After a few weeks break, The Flash Season 9 is finally back. Now, yes, up until this point, the season has been pretty bad. Any hope I had for the season basically died in the final scene of episode 1, but if there was any episode that I was still holding out hope for, it's definitely this one. An episode featuring the only good villain Eric Wallace ever gave us in Bloodwork, an episode featuring John Diggle and the return of Kid Flash, and of course, Green Arrow. No matter how bad the season got, I remained excited for this episode because honestly, how could I not be? With that in mind, did the episode live up to the expectations or did it disappoint? Well, this video is a review of The Flash Season 9 Episode 9 titled It's My Party and I'll Die If I Want To, which I gotta say, I don't like that title, I don't really get it, it's not exactly what I would have called this episode, and the same goes for the series finale, which is A New World Part 4. In fact, the next 4 episodes are all just called A New World Part 1, 2, 3, and 4. Like, that's so uncreative. While we're on the topic of the negative, let's just get anything bad I have to say about this episode out of the way, because for what is basically the first time this season, I have a lot more positive to say than negative, so let's just start with the negative and get it out of the way. The side characters are mostly pushed to the side, which is great, but honestly, the episode would have been better had they been pushed to the side even more, because too much of the episode focuses on Chester and Allegra for me not to consider that a negative. It isn't a huge deal or anything, I just think that any screen time dedicated to them would have been better served given to Wally, Diggle, Oliver, Barry, or even Bloodwork, because that's probably the biggest fault with this episode. So much happens and it's all just one episode. I think it could have been way better off if it was a two-parter. Now yes, one episode is exactly what I expected, but that doesn't change the episode feeling a bit too fast-paced and rushed, while also for some reason dedicating a good amount of screen time to things that don't really contribute, like Chester and Allegra and their relationship. What's really frustrating about this is that this wouldn't have been an issue if instead of the filler episodes, one of them would have been a first part to this crossover, and they didn't even need to feature Oliver until like an end of the episode teaser, but just have Barry, Wally, Bloodwork before Oliver joins in, just because not only condensing the crossover into one episode wasn't a great idea, but also the crossover deals a lot with Team Flash discovering the multiverse, which is built upon from the Red Death arc, where she comes from an alternate universe, but they think it's an alternate timeline, and also, it took them way too long to address Caitlyn's death, which is something that they do address in this episode, and it's a huge positive that I'll get to later, but that should have happened way earlier in the season. We should have had the 5 episodes of the Red Death arc, followed by the first part to this episode, followed by this episode, and then maybe you could have a couple filler episodes before the 4-part finale. Everything about the structure of this season was really off, and it could have been a lot better. One final thing for the negatives is that this episode does have a good amount of those pesky flashbacks, which are always annoying, one of which doesn't even make sense. Wally has a flashback to his memories from the Flashpoint timeline, which he shouldn't be able to remember, but that's a minor complaint. This episode is clearly not perfect, but it is probably the best we could have hoped for, and easily, by far, the best episode of the season so far, probably better than any episode in Season 8 as well. And that's in no small part due to the villain. Eric Wallace, back in Season 6, knocked it out of the park with his first new villain once he became showrunner, with Ramsey Rosso, aka Bloodwork. Ever since then, every villain has ranged from alright to absolutely horrendous, so it was probably a good idea to bring that one villain he did really well back for this episode. Ramsey is threatening, probably more so because of Senthil Ramamurthy's performance than anything. His Bloodwork form is cool, even if we don't really get to see much of it, nor does it really do much on screen, but what makes Bloodwork as a villain special is not his Bloodwork form, but his unique powers, allowing for these great scenes of getting into Barry and Wally's head in an attempt to manipulate them to side with him, which made for the best episode of Season 6, and some great moments here, including a harkening back to Wally's main source of conflict with Barry in Season 2, which is presented now as repressed rage and baggage. And Kenan Lonsdale does do a great job with that, but it's actually with Grant Gustin on the Barry Allen side of this story that the episode really shines, as this part of the episode focuses on his survivor's guilt. In fact, the whole episode focuses on just that, which I gotta say, with all the awesome fan servicey returns and moments, it was honestly Barry's survivor's guilt and the focus on that and Grant Gustin's performance that was my favorite part of the episode. Right from the get-go, Diggle gives Barry Oliver's bow that they apparently just found, and they go on to talk about their grief over the death of Oliver and grief as a whole, followed by Diggle finally addressing something that Team Flash has been blatantly and honestly disgustingly ignoring: Caitlyn's death. Barry's response to this also feels very genuine, saying it helps having Keon around, but something feels off about it. And yeah, dude, it's weird. I can't tell you how gratifying it was to finally hear Barry acknowledge Caitlyn and the fact that he cared about her and how unusual the Keon situation is, but it actually doesn't end there either. Bloodwork tries to take Barry over by manipulating him using his survivor's guilt, specifically with Frost and even more specifically with Caitlyn Snow, and I'm just so glad they're finally showing the effect Caitlyn's death had on Barry because it was genuinely so weird they weren't up until now. That being said, maybe they were saving it for this episode. It works really well for this episode specifically, but for the whole season, it's far too late. I don't think we realized how damaging those 3 filler episodes were for the structure of the season, not only because there were 3 pointless episodes without the Flash in a row, but also they pushed off something that needed to be addressed right after the Red Death arc ended, Caitlyn Snow's death. Right when things started to calm down and people could think about things that were happening recently, that's when they needed to address all of this, not 2 months later because of the 3 episodes and a month break. Still though, this episode specifically excelled in the emotion department thanks to its focus on Barry's survivor's guilt, which they put in this episode, I think, because it fits really well with Oliver Queen, who is basically defined by that guilt. There are scenes like the first conversation where Barry and Oliver talk about how Barry doesn't want to come back because he doesn't feel like he deserves it, which is very emotional. Barry getting Wally to break free of Ramsey's hold, the final scene with Oliver and Barry, and of course, Ramsey's whole attempt to sway Barry to his side in this very meta scene that borderline broke the fourth wall, which was pretty cool, but also featured Caitlyn Snow, all which created this through line, emotionally speaking, which emotionally connected together an episode that already had a lot going for it in the fan service department, but this elevated it from fun to truly great and genuinely made me tear up, which I wouldn't have guessed this season was actually capable of doing. A close comparison I think would be Spider-Man No Way Home, which a lot of it is about fan service, but it actually has this emotional through line that works really well. This episode is obviously not No Way Home levels, but for the CW and for the Flash and Arrow and a crossover between them, this is actually genuinely fantastic because of that emotional through line. But speaking of that fan service, a part of the fan service was Wally West's return. Wally West, in a similar situation to Roy Harper on Arrow, was the main hero's sidekick from the comics, although for him it's only kind of, whose actor wanted to leave the show, and consequently, the character simply did not appear enough throughout the show's run, really only having a single season, season 3, where he appeared throughout. Returning sporadically, Wally was always someone who it was really nice to see again, and that was indeed the case for this episode as well. Seeing Wally interact with Barry and Iris is nice, although Joe's absence with that is definitely felt in that regard. The fight between Flash and Kid Flash was pretty cool, if a bit iffy on the CGI, and then the two teaming up was really cool as well. The episode ends in such a way that it feels like Wally might be sticking around for the next 4 episodes, which is something that I would definitely welcome with open arms, but based on everything we've heard about these episodes, it doesn't feel like he will, which if he doesn't, that's a shame because this episode kind of feels like an unresolved character who already had his final resolution, which works really well for the episode. In fact, Wally feels more three-dimensional than he did in season 6. He feels more flawed, and that's a good thing, but I wouldn't say it's a satisfying final appearance for Kid Flash. It's a great appearance in general, but hopefully he returns for one more episode, hopefully in the series finale, although it doesn't look like he will be. In a bit of a similar situation to Wally, Oliver Queen is also a character who got a resolution in a prior season, or in this case, a crossover. Although, unlike Wally, I would say this remains a satisfying conclusion to the character, with the explanation of him only being able to interfere when the multiverse is in danger. He can't just return to his life or the role of Green Arrow whenever he wants. Plus, it explains how he showed up in the Earth Prime comic, since I guess the multiverse was about to be in danger. Also, hearing a bit of explanation about Red Death in this episode simply being from another universe, specifically Earth 4125, that was really cool, and another example of why this should have happened right after the Red Death arc. It's just such a natural sequel and follow-up to that arc. But let's be honest, it's Oliver Queen that we're all here for, and yeah, there's a reason for that. From the second Oliver was put on screen and began interacting with Barry, I was transported back to the good old days of the annual crossover events of the Arrowverse, which were always at their best when Grant and Steven simply got to play off each other. Their natural chemistry is palpable, making all their interactions not just really fun, but after this 10-year history, it gives an emotional weight to their interactions. As for this crossover specifically, it represents the true conclusion to the Arrowverse, which began all the way back in 2012, and that in particular hit me like a ton of bricks, because no matter what my personal opinions are now about this universe and their individual shows and seasons, there's no denying the impact the universe, and specifically The Flash, and even more specifically Arrow, had on my life, as this channel simply would not exist without it. And now, for all of the faults of this season, The Flash actually surprised me with what is genuinely a satisfying final crossover, and one last team-up with Green Arrow, complete with an Arrow title card, music from Arrow, some great moments with Diggle, one of which had a Brightest Day nice reference to Green Lantern, an Arrow-style fight scene, which there were moments where you could tell that the stunt double wasn't Stephen Amell, but damn if I don't love these fight scenes, which Arrow excelled at. And of course, one final "You Have Failed This City," which, if I remember correctly, Crisis on Infinite Earths didn't do. Instead, he said "You have failed this universe," even though he should have said "You have failed this multiverse." Anyway, back to this episode. It's not perfect. There are things I would change. There are episodes I would get rid of in exchange for making this a two-parter. And the episode definitely could have fit the structure of the season better had it been placed earlier, but this is probably the best we could have hoped for, as a fun, fan service heavy, emotional, like very emotional, well acted, and even well written final crossover and conclusion to the Arrowverse, to which I'd give a 9 out of 10, which is a lot higher than any other episode in this season. Here's hoping that The Flash has a good conclusion as well, although holy shit, is that Matt Letcher's Reverse Flash in the next episode set in the year 2000? Holy shit, let's go!